I sifted through the indoor air sampling results line by line, and it's evident the technical center is unsalvageable with exposure risks both the EPA and Health Department vehemently agree are exceptional. But of the hundreds of samples taken in the other buildings, less than a quarter exceed the school action level, and only a handful surpass the EPA's published guidance. So if the EPA knows that Vermont is operating on modern research and they are operating on 30-year-old research, why hasn't the EPA caught up with Vermont? Our brave little state is on the bleeding edge of what the world's leading PCB experts tell me will inevitably become a national health problem, leaving our state officials and residents to navigate uncharted territory as we likely build a blueprint for the rest of the country. Some mental health advocates are concerned River Valley is too big. They also worry how the state will staff the additional 9 beds if existing facilities are struggling to retain and recruit employees, forcing many to close the beds we already have. That's why opponents argue the state could have made wiser investments with that $25 million. River Valley won't initially open at full capacity. The state is hiring 63 full-time positions for the Essex facility, but right now there are only 32 full-time employees in Middlesex. So while the state hopes most people will stay on board, that still leaves at least 31 vacancies. Once construction here is finished, the 7 residents living in Middlesex will transfer to Essex. The facility plans to bring the 9 additional beds online gradually as the state hires the personnel to staff them. It's the aftermath of that internal threat. Once police cruisers have cleared the scene and kids are back in the classroom, the team of people who are answering that student's cry for help. It's been more than 2.5 years since the Burlington School District permanently shuttered these doors, wrapping the buildings in yellow caution tape and prominently posting chemical hazard signs. That fall of 2020, students were preparing to embark on their first pandemic-era academic year through a hybrid learning model. But they'd only spend 1 day in the North Avenue campus classrooms before their educational experience would forever become entangled in an unprecedented statewide problem. Frustration, sadness, outrage, confusion. A flurry of emotions Chittenden County Senator Martine Gulick says is still plaguing her Burlington constituents and neighbors.
Ultimately, a lack of trust in our agencies and, frankly, in our government, which is very disappointing as someone who's now serving in the legislature.
Now the Burlington School Board member and mom to 2 former students is using her platform to push for retribution. Their high school condemned, nearly 1,000 students settle into the former Macy's department store on Cherry Street in March 2021, after 6 months of full remote learning. A massive disruption, Gulick says, compromising education in a community comprised of many new Americans and high levels of poverty.
This was like a slap in the face. It put us back years.
Do you think state officials should be held accountable for the harm caused to the Burlington community?
I do think state officials should be held accountable. To this day, I'm still surprised that there's been no sort of admittance of any gaffes or any wrongdoing. There's been no apologies for what happened in Burlington.
The saga starts in 2013. That's when the Vermont Health Department issues this internal memo announcing the state is launching a pilot program testing the indoor air for PCBs in 4 Vermont schools. This after several schools in the northeastern United States detected potentially dangerous levels in their buildings. Also in that memo, a new 15 nanograms per cubic meter screening standard, significantly more conservative than the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's recommendations of 70 to 600 nanograms per meter cubed for daycare to high school-aged students. In 2014, upon the study's completion, state officials distribute this letter to school administrators. PCB levels are detected above the 15 nanogram per meter cubed threshold at Champlain Elementary in Burlington and Barrytown Middle and Elementary School. But the state says the results do not warrant a statewide investigation. They do encourage, not require, districts with old or leaky light ballasts, a common source of PCBs, pay for their own indoor air testing. Then in 2016, Massachusetts Senator Ed Markey sounds the alarm on the toxic threat of PCBs in nearly a third of America's schools. The ABCs of PCBs thrusts the discussion onto the national stage. Vermont officials respond with another memo, reassuring schools the 2013 pilot study proved PCBs are not a serious problem here. Fast forward 4 years, Burlington prepares to renovate the aging BHS and BTC buildings, so consultants collect samples that would soon become consequential. I sifted through the indoor air sampling results line by line, and it's evident the technical center is unsalvageable, with exposure risks both the EPA and health department vehemently agree are exceptional. But of the hundreds of samples taken in the other buildings, less than a quarter exceed the school action level, and only a handful surpass the EPA's published guidance. In May 2021, based on that data, the district resolves to abandon its renovation plan and demolish the North Avenue campus, a cheaper choice than extensive contamination cleanup. That June, the discovery triggers statewide concern, and Vermont enacts a law establishing a PCB school testing program and, for the first time, tasking the health department with developing a set of legally enforceable standards. It's November 2021 when those numbers are released that many Burlington families' faith in the reconstruction project falters.
Seeing my daughter watch the news and tear up and say, "What, you mean they didn't have to close my school after all?"
This is probably the worst scandal in Vermont since JP. That's incredible that this has happened and 1,000 kids have suffered.
The health department, unannounced, introduces the so-called school action levels for the future testing framework. Officials determine a high school is only mandated to mitigate if the results meet or exceed 100 nanograms per meter cubed.
To have those numbers shift months later in a very sort of quiet rolling out, yeah, it does make you wonder, could it have all gone down very differently? They didn't tell us. We had to find out, I think maybe even from you.
Despite mounting doubt and the apparent rewriting of its own rules, the health department doubles down on its recommendation to condemn the campus, stressing even microscopic amounts of PCBs are hazardous, and BHS appears riddled with them. School administrators follow state and federal guidance.
This is a sick building, and that's clearly proven now. I have no question that we made the right decision to prioritize the health of our community, and no one felt that this building was safe for us to be in. Those were really dark times.
Though it's unlikely to pass, a bill before the legislature would hit the pause button on the PCB school testing program. It would also grant Burlington $16 million for demolition and contamination removal, less than 10% of the $190 million price tag. While proposed state funds remain on the fringe, city voters will pay off a $165 million bond, and the district will cover the rest with $25 million of surplus cash.
Yes, we passed this bond, which felt like a great victory for our community, but at the end of the day, did we have a choice?
To defray the cost, the Burlington School District is also suing PCB manufacturer Monsanto. But the chemical giant's parent company, Bayer Pharmaceuticals, contends state officials effectively wrote the campus's death certificate a decade ago when they created the 15 nanograms per meter cubed screening standard. So, does Burlington High School need to be destroyed? Should kids have stayed in their classroom, if on a limited basis, during those 6 months of learning limbo? Could Burlington have avoided those really dark times? In part 2 of my investigation, I'm getting you answers from Vermont's top doctor. That's in my one-on-one interview with Health Commissioner Dr. Mark Levine Thursday at 6. Does the state owe Burlington anything for what happened here?
There's no way I can say that either the Department of Health or any sector of state government did anything wrong in this entire process, and that, if anything, the city of Burlington's actions and the predicament they found themselves in helped the rest of the state because it generated the need for legislation and an entire testing and regulatory framework that didn't exist before. In real time, we are protecting Vermont students and staff from the toxicity of PCBs.
It's a point of pride for Health Commissioner Dr. Mark Levine that Vermont is proving itself a pioneer in the exploration of PCB contamination in schools. But the question on many minds, did forging a path to the future cost Burlington taxpayers millions of dollars and hundreds, if not thousands of students, a quality education and social emotional stability?
Burlington students sustained more harm than any other town or city in Vermont. That is the argument from families because of the school closure. What do you say to that?
We are a data-driven health department. I need to see the data that actually supports that. This adding insult to injury, while it wasn't good, I'm not sure it made Burlington students even less able to rally and have the resilience they need compared to other high school students.
Statistics measuring learning loss from the pandemic will never have because there was no statewide assessment. I did obtain enrollment data from the Burlington School District revealing from when the campus closed in fall 2020 to the end of the first full year at downtown BHS in spring 2022. About 100 students transferred to another public, private, or alternative school, dropped out, or moved out of state. This academic year, though, enrollment bounced back to pre-pandemic figures.
There was no formal state recommendation that the school be closed.
But Superintendent Tom Flanagan and the school board say following the health department's guidance felt like an obligation, not an option.
We didn't have a choice.
The decision, Levine and Flanagan say, was made in consultation with knowledgeable EPA officials and PCB experts, who remarked in astonishment they'd never seen numbers like the 7,000 nanograms per meter cubed PCB concentration detected in the tech center's indoor air. Testing results from the other 5 buildings spurred outrage among Burlington families. I analyzed the data, and none of the hundreds of samples exceed the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's guidance of 600 nanograms per meter cubed for high school-aged students. Then, in November 2021, when lawmakers charged the health department with creating a new set of standards for the statewide PCB school testing program, officials established the so-called school action levels, 6 times more stringent than the EPA's.
Why the large departure from the EPA's recommendations?
The EPA's research that their levels were derived from is from 1994. The research that we are using in determining our levels is almost 30 years more modern.
So if the EPA knows that Vermont is operating on modern research and they are operating on 30-year-old research, why hasn't the EPA caught up with Vermont?
Compare it to sort of a sailboat versus an ocean liner. It's much more easy for us to pivot at a state level than it is for a federal structure like the EPA to do that.
Still, less than a quarter of the BHS BTC sampling results surpassed the state's 100 nanogram per meter cubed school action level.
Why couldn't students reoccupy Burlington High School? It was during the pandemic that this was all happening, so students were learning remote half of the time anyway. That was the plan. So it's almost like by design, they would have had spent limited time in those spaces.
We can't look retrospectively and say, now that we know what every room looked like in those schools, could students have gone to building A and building B, but not any of the other buildings, or what have you? We'll never know that.
Levine explains that's because the campus wasn't tested for PCBs using the protocol we use now, an inventory method that groups like rooms constructed with similar materials together. Though consultants only sample about a third of the total spaces in any given school, results from one room are applied to others in the same group. In short, the sample results from BHS and BTC aren't an accurate reflection of the magnitude of PCB contamination there. But as Vermont communities face legally mandated testing in their own schools now, could we have avoided this rush to remediate had the state conducted a more comprehensive pilot study back in 2013?
How could we possibly know, based on the results of just 4 schools, that we didn't need to test the rest of the schools in Vermont?
Keep in mind, 2013 was a very different time. Most states had not done any pilots of any sort. And not knowing the ramifications at that point in time, we felt comfortable saying we've at least done due diligence.
Is that good science?
It was good for the time. This integration of the non-cancer effects of PCBs has, I think, been the most important finding of this last decade.
Does Vermont have a reputation of being ahead of the game when it comes to public health?
We do, and that's a double-edged sword, because we tend to do the right thing first, and then people look and go, wow.
Our rap sheet shows, Levine insists, Vermont was right to implement strict regulations for lead and PFAS first, and we're in the vanguard now with PCBs. Soon, he's certain other state and federal officials will follow suit.
Why should families trust the Vermont Health Department and its recommendations over the EPA?
Because the EPA is actually at our side. So even though it may be delayed from our pilot study in 2013, we've picked up the ball very briskly and are doing really landmark work here.
Our brave little state is on the bleeding edge of what the world's leading PCB experts tell me will inevitably become a national health problem, leaving our state officials and residents to navigate uncharted territory as we likely build a blueprint for the rest of the country. Proctor High School is one of about 325 schools required by state law to participate in Vermont's unprecedented PCB program. I tag along with an environmental consultant as they test the classrooms for this dangerous forever chemical.
Perfect. It's called a low-flow air sampling pump, and it is strapped onto a tripod to get it up to, an average sort of child's breathing level, between 3 and 4 feet off the ground.
Harper Environmental Associates is one of 6 consulting firms the state hired to conduct the indoor air testing. The way this device works, Director Craig Sterrett says, it pulls air into the clear tubing and a cartridge captures PCB emissions. So it's this piece of foam right here that's collecting the PCBs?
This white thing right here, yeah.
And these are set up throughout the building?
They are, yes. Right now we're on the basement level of this school where there are classrooms and gym facilities and the cafeteria. It's a 24-hour sampling period, and the reason it's that long is the levels of the PCBs that we're looking at are very, very, very low.
Levels measured in microscopic amounts, nanograms per cubic meter. But even the tiniest concentrations are a huge hazard. Sterrett explains consultants sample more than 1/3 of the rooms in any given school, up to half in smaller buildings like Proctor's.
The first step of all of this is we come and do what's called a building inventory, and we go into every room and area in the school, every single interior space, and we identify every single material that could possibly contain PCBs.
Paints, caulks, glues, plastics, fluorescent light ballasts, transformers, ceiling tiles, window glazing, spray-on fireproofing, all common culprits.
827.
Over time, those materials break down, releasing the cancer-causing chemical into the air. Toxic air students, staff, and faculty may breathe for years. How would you explain to parents why every classroom in every school doesn't need to be tested?
Schools are pretty cookie cutter, and the 4th grade classroom's usually right next to the 5th grade classroom and made with the exact same materials.
The samples collected in schools are shipped to labs like Pace Analytical for processing. Once state officials receive the results, they alert the districts. In the worst cases, like Burlington High School, rooms or entire buildings could be condemned.
The indoor air sampling that we do serves 2 purposes. One is to see if there is an immediate danger to the health of building occupants, and the second is if there are PCBs in a room, they're coming from a source.
The state is covering the cost for environmental consultants like Harper to test the indoor air in the estimated 325 schools. But that's it. Every effort after that is on the district's dime. The cost to investigate PCB sources and clean up contamination comes out of the taxpayer's pocket, and schools that exceed action levels can't opt out. The Vermont legislature has earmarked 3 pots of funding, $4.5 million for the initial testing, $32 million for assessment, mitigation, and remediation, and $2.5 million for urgent source sampling and cleanup. Mitigation reduces concentrations in the air by improving ventilation, replacing HVAC filters, or wiping down surfaces. Remediation removes the PCB-containing material completely. Whether that's enough money to do the work will depend on the number of schools with contamination and the severity of the problem in each. State officials propose the districts foot the bills up front.
Yeah, next up.
Then the state reimburse up to 80% of the costs.
Where's your next?
But the legislature hasn't given that plan the green light yet.
If it wasn't for the legislature making this a priority, we would not be looking at it.
Since 2021, DEC's Patricia Coppolino has led the team laying the program's foundation. Historically, she says, PCB contamination is regulated federally. But Vermont took the issue into its own hands, designing a unique and efficient approach. Rather than sampling building materials at random, hunting for the cause to minimize the effect, the state's method is to detect the effect first, then eliminate the cause.
In the spaces where PCBs exist, then you focus your time and effort that way.
Coppolino says other states are already asking Vermont officials for guidance as leaders explore similar mandates and consider establishing programs of their own.
Let's go to the cafeteria.
Collaboration and communication is key, she says, while the country faces a steep learning curve.
Building a program from the ground up and having to implement it pretty quickly afterwards has been difficult, but with some really great partners, it's been something that we can really hang our hats on and say we're doing the best that we can.
The testing schedule prioritizes the oldest schools and those serving the youngest students in the most disadvantaged communities. Since testing started in September 2022, DEC has published 19 schools' results publicly. Of those, 7 contain contaminated spaces, 2 of which demand immediate action. And those totals are moving targets, constantly rising as results roll in from the labs weekly. What is it like for you and your company to work on this first-in-the-nation, unprecedented PCB program?
This is the largest scale investigation that I've worked on because there are so many pieces to it. And being able to be part of a team that is learning how to solve this problem, just a rewarding process.
DEC is requesting a 1-year extension to complete the sampling phase of the project, pushing the deadline from July 2025 to July 2026. Department officials also say the $4.5 million dedicated to the program probably isn't sufficient, so they're planning on asking the legislature for more financing in 2024. To some, a climb-resistant fence symbolizes psychiatric institutions of old, not facilities of the future. But the Department of Mental Health has demonstrated the dire need for a place to safely house and effectively treat a small cohort of Vermonters who can't receive adequate mental health care anywhere else. So by late spring, officials plan to open this state-owned and operated 16-bed recovery residence off Route 15 in Essex that all agree is a decade overdue. The property where Vermont's only juvenile detention facility once stood has a new purpose. Last fall, the state demolished the Woodside Youth Rehabilitation Center and began building this more than 17,000 square foot structure from the ground up. River Valley Therapeutic Community Residence.
You can see from the entrance we have a front porch, which is just like if you entered a home.
Outside in the courtyard, a paved walking path, gazebo, and raised garden beds.
We also have a greenhouse behind me where they can do potting and planting.
Through these doors, project manager Tabrina Karish and her team from the Vermont Buildings and General Services Department are exchanging the cold concrete blocks with warm wooden beams.
So these are all bedrooms.
The facility features 2 patient wings, 8 spacious bedrooms on each side.
This is a typical bedroom. It'll have a built-in desk, a full-size bed, a built-in window seat with some wardrobe storage. Each bedroom also has its own bathroom. Yes, it's a big room, yes.
And it's for one person?
Yes.
The wings separated by a core of communal spaces.
Behind me is a dining room. In front of me will be a skills kitchen for the residents to use.
Plus a multi-purpose area, art studio, sensory room, and exercise gym. This happened so fast. But while the state has raised a residence out of rubble in seemingly record time, River Valley has been in the works for almost 2 decades. Since 2005, several years before Tropical Storm Irene destroyed the Vermont State Hospital in Waterbury. In 2012, the legislature passed Act 160 and Act 79, both codifying the statutory basis of a secure residential recovery facility, where the patients are supervised 24/7 and physically locked on the premises. That's when the state created the 7-bed Middlesex Therapeutic Community Residence, a campus of FEMA trailers. Since it opened in 2013, what was intended as a temporary site has long outlived its lifespan and fallen into disrepair, while consistently operating near or at capacity. Then in 2019, the Mental Health Department presented data to lawmakers detailing why simply replacing the 7 beds at the Middlesex facility wasn't sufficient. The state had to go bigger and better and fast.
We needed to expand to reach out to more people, to be able to support more people, but we wanted to make sure to not lose that homey feeling.
River Valley Program Director Troy Para with the Mental Health Department tells me this therapeutic community residence is transitional. Here, residents stay for between 6 to 18 months, developing domestic habits like shopping for groceries, cleaning the home, and practicing social engagement. Life skills integral to their independence, while also participating in group and individual therapy and learning coping mechanisms.
Maybe there's still challenges there, and we can hopefully help them prepare for those.
The 2019 analysis of need for residential mental health beds shows almost all referrals to the current facility in Middlesex are from intensive inpatient hospital settings, Vermont's highest level of mental health care. At any given time, the report says 7 to 10 Vermonters requiring treatment could step down from a hospital to a physically secure recovery residence like the new facility in Essex. This is a population of people whose psychiatric symptoms have stabilized enough to leave the hospital, but still pose a risk to themselves or others. A patient is only admitted to River Valley on an involuntary court order under the custody of the mental health commissioner. Some may meet this criteria if they've been accused of a crime, even murder, and a judge rules they're incompetent to stand trial. Many struggle with behavioral dysregulation and experience sporadic violent episodes. So they're no longer in active crisis, but they aren't ready to rejoin the community, and other recovery programs that aren't equipped to keep them safe turn them away. Some mental health advocates are concerned River Valley is too big. They also worry how the state will staff the additional 9 beds if existing facilities are struggling to retain and recruit employees, forcing many to close the beds we already have. That's why opponents argue the state could have made wiser investments with that $25 million.
You could get a lot bigger bang for your buck to invest in those things that prevent a need for a higher level of care, prevent someone from getting into crisis, or enable them to move out of a hospital instead of using a hospital bed.
House Committee on Healthcare Vice Chair Representative Ann Donahue has been involved in the legislative approval process for a new physically secure psychiatric facility since discussions began in 2005.
There was no question we needed to replace the secure facility in Middlesex, and there was, I think, near unanimous support for that. But to more than double it in size, we didn't feel that the justification had been demonstrated.
This graphic illustrates Vermont's mental health system. From the most acute beds, inpatient hospitalization, down to the most independent beds, group homes, and staffed housing. River Valley, a secure step-down facility, sits here on the continuum. Donahue attests, rather than dumping $25 million into one building that serves a narrow subset of patients, the state should have dispersed the money between these lower-level preventative programs, benefiting potentially hundreds of Vermonters as opposed to just 16. Session after session, Donahue says the state has failed to prioritize the right resources.
It's always next year that never happens. So in theory, will this be the year where we see significant investment in community-based care? I'm not hearing signs of that yet.
Though they do acknowledge other programs are starved for support, state officials remain confident the Essex facility must come first and will ease pressure on Vermont's acute bed availability. That's because without an appropriate place to go, patients eligible for discharge to a secure residence, however small in number, are left in limbo, occupying the limited intensive inpatient hospital beds for months at a time. In its pitch for a 16-bed secure residence, the Mental Health Department explained vacating those spots and filling them with acute cases presenting in our emergency rooms will free up resources at the first line of defense, expediting the flow of patients through the entire mental health care system. River Valley won't initially open at full capacity. The state is hiring 63 full-time positions for the Essex facility, but right now there are only 32 full-time employees in Middlesex. So while the state hopes most people will stay on board, that still leaves at least 31 vacancies. Once construction here is finished, the 7 residents living in Middlesex will transfer to Essex. The facility plans to bring the 9 additional beds online gradually as the state hires the personnel to staff them. State officials say they saw this crisis coming at least 5 years ago. They've been exploring options to expand recruitment and retention, including long-term strategies like loan reimbursements and scholarships. But in the meantime, hospitals have been trying to control a bleeding system with Band-Aids. So I wanted to know, what can we do right now? Nurses on the front lines tell me we must immediately pay full-time staff more money if we want to attract or keep them here.
I work aside travelers who are great, but they are making 4 times as much as me.
If the hourly wage was better, I'm sure more nurses would be able to stay here longer.
It does hurt when you don't feel like your work is valued.
3 registered nurses working at Vermont's largest hospital with 3 unique perspectives. After working at UVM Medical Center for 6 years, Elise Legere plans to quit and pursue a travel contract out of New York City with 3 kids under 5 and a husband in tow. Despite adoring her time living in Vermont since last July, travel nurse Rebecca Call isn't interested in staying after her assignment ends next month. And Benton Taylor, who moved to a state he loves 4 years ago, has since lost a lot of his love for the job that brought him here.
I can confidently say that if I made a wage that matched the cost of living here, we definitely wouldn't have even considered leaving because it's just a lot to uproot our family.
That's because Legere says while the Green Mountains may be beautiful and she enjoys her position, neither is paying the bills.
One wintry day, I made a snowman.
A combination of factors are contributing to her decision, including lack of affordable and accessible childcare and housing. But she says pay is the main motivator. And receiving significantly less compensation than her travel nurse counterparts can be demoralizing.
They're making really smart financial decisions for themselves, and why wouldn't they if they're able to? They're really empathetic towards us. I mean, they're not sitting there like, heh, making 4 times more than you. They're like, you guys need to make more money.
While nurses like Legere are enticed by the promise of better pay, the staff nurses who do stick around assume additional responsibilities. Amid the revolving door of temporary personnel, Benton Taylor says permanent staff must brief travelers on important policies and procedures so quality of patient care isn't compromised.
In addition to just like being a nurse and doing my job, we're constantly, training these people that come for a short period of time. So then you're also training people again and again and again, and it just wears you down. It's harder to have, good teamwork when you just don't know the team that you're working with.
It's a cycle of burnout and instability that's pushing people out of the profession. In December, the Vermont Talent Pipeline Management published a survey forecasting that between today and next September, Vermont will need to hire more than 6,200 nurses in new or replacement roles.
Wonderful, thank you so much.
42% of whom should be licensed RNs, where the need is greatest. The findings conclude filling those positions is the only way hospitals will drastically reduce their dependency on expensive travelers.
There are a lot of people in the agency that need to get paid.
Employers pay agencies $150 to $200 an hour per nurse. The travelers themselves take home about $80 to $100 an hour. Vermont's registered nurses make an average of about $38 an hour.
Sometimes it takes really a crisis for everybody to come together.
Green Mountain Care Board Chair Kevin Mullen says we have to start by raising nurses' salaries.
Now we're at a point in time where I think that people realize the seriousness of the situation and will make those hard choices.
Choices like approving higher budgets and accepting potential rate hikes, meaning cost for the patient could go up. The board regulates hospital budgets and insurance premium rates. So Mullen says his team will need to ensure hospitals' submissions are allocating resources towards effective retention and recruitment efforts before giving them the green light.
It's going to be painful, but it's going to be less painful taking the steps necessary to fix this nursing crisis than it would be if we started to lose loved ones because they didn't have access to care.
President and CEO of the Vermont Association of Hospitals and Health Systems, Jeff Tiemann, trusts providers and the state can strike the right balance.
If we can get some financial support from the state to help with those retention and recruitment costs, then we can relieve some of the pressure on the ratepayer side.
And that's exactly what Governor Phil Scott's budget proposes. Invest $33 million in a program run by the Agency of Human Services to fund recruitment, retention, and training initiatives established by healthcare employers.
Provide things like potentially retention bonuses, sign-on bonuses, or other creative and innovative strategies.
Another important strategy, expedite visas for international nurse hires. Vermont's Director of Healthcare Reform, Ina Backus, says living in a region with Boston and New York City, where a worker in any sector could make more money, creates an incredibly competitive market.
These employers have to be thinking about how their compensation keeps pace with their peers, whether or not it's reasonable to keep pace with traveling staff agencies and what they are offering is a different question.
Vermont's permanent nurses tell me they don't expect employers to completely close the pay gap, just decrease the huge disparity that's driving them away when they would otherwise stay.
As much as I don't feel well compensated, I have great coworkers, I love my patients, and I really like the culture of the hospital I work at.
Mullen, Tiemann, and Backus all agree the solution calls for a multi-tiered approach. On the state level, the legislature will need to approve the governor's proposals. And on the national level, the federal government must determine if travel agencies are price gouging. Our own Congressman Peter Welch is leading the charge to find that out. PBIS starts with strategies that teach and reinforce school-wide expectations, like how to be safe, kind, and responsible. But no matter how strong those efforts are, some students will need more attention. Tonight, I'm taking you back inside Gertrude Chamberlain School in South Burlington to examine their intensive and targeted interventions and how the school is preventing strains on its staff. Christina French is one of 2 behavioral interventionists at Gertrude Chamberlain Elementary School. Her job, work directly with students every day, all day, who need intensive supports.
So this is our sensory room.
French tells me the school's sensory room is one of the most popular and one of Gertrude Chamberlain's greatest PBIS assets. So on average, how many kids are coming through this room every day?
I would say probably 20 to 30 kids.
Under the PBIS framework, students with targeted or intensive supports, those top 2 tiers on the PBIS pyramid, benefit from this room, equipped with a basketball net, bicycle, trampoline, and even a swing. In here, students can yell about frustrations, release physical aggression, expend extra energy, and calm distressed feelings. French says this is not a playground, and these aren't toys. It's a tactic to avoid disruptions in the classroom.
Moving, but in a safe way that's not going to alter his classmates' learning, his teacher's ability to teach.
I've never seen anything like this. While French says the sensory room is useful, the PBIS framework avoids an exclusionary approach. The ultimate goal, help struggling students succeed inside the classroom. That's where French spends most of her time. She supports 3 students total. Tonight, she takes me inside her first grader's classroom.
So that's his seat.
Always in hand, one of these binders. They hold each child's individualized behavioral support plan and are packed with tools custom designed for that student's needs.
So this is our visual schedule. It tells us where we need to be, what the space is going to look like, and what we might be doing.
And there's one of these for every day of the week.
There is. So today was Thursday, so this was our schedule just for today.
The student can also point to the pictures on these pages to communicate emotions.
So we like to stay right around here.
What are some of the greatest rewards that you've seen in this job?
Seeing the progress that they can make. I was with a kid for 3 years, and we were in a small space, and the next year we're in the classroom. He graduated from the classroom with all of his classmates.
French tells me while witnessing growth makes the challenging job worth the work, the caseload can spread her thin.
It really takes all of your attention, focus, and then you're flying from the seat of your pants a lot.
Vermont PBIS, the organization promoting the PBIS behavioral support model, cites only up to 5% of a school's student population should require Tier 3 intensive supports, and up to only 15% of students typically need Tier 2 targeted supports. But schools are now seeing those numbers trending upward, at least an additional 5%.
Students with social, emotional, and behavioral needs often require more staffing.
Staffing the state simply doesn't have, a problem the Agency of Education hasn't yet presented a plan to solve. Tracy Harris, AOE's Social, Emotional, and Behavioral Support Coordinator, stresses the top-heavy PBIS pyramid is not sustainable, especially during the pandemic. Even 2 years ago, specialized resources were strained. Now, it's practically impossible to fill the hundreds of paraeducator and behavior specialist positions open in districts throughout Vermont.
It's very difficult. We're in a difficult place for students, families, teachers, school systems.
Vermont PBIS leaders suggest a proactive approach could be the key.
What can they do at the universal level that helps prevent some of those students from becoming at risk of needing additional support?
Amy Wheeler-Sutton says schools should lean on the expertise of behavioral support staff like French to develop those ideas. At Gertrude Chamberlain, Peace Corners are designed for any dysregulated student.
The teacher will simply ask them to come to the Peace Corner. There are strategies for breathing, for calming down. If they want to identify their feelings, they can trace the mazes.
Every classroom has a Peace Corner, so teachers can continue their lessons while a student can take a productive break from their peers. It's an intervention that doesn't rely on extra manpower. This one is stocked with fidget toys, relaxation tools, and soothing images. Some the students drew themselves.
Their own, ideas of where or what is peaceful.
Gertrude Chamberlain also has a mental health clinician who works for the Howard Center embedded in the building with an 11-student caseload. She supports individuals and leads small groups throughout the week. A lot of schools don't have a resource like that because the district must buy the service from their county's designated mental health agency. However, Vermont PBIS says it is collaborating with a few districts around the state to intentionally integrate mental health experts into schools. So the clinicians aren't just helping a handful of kids, they're supporting the entire student population. There's no one set of solutions, but there is one system the state says schools might want to try. It's a multi-tiered framework called PBIS. That stands for Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. Tonight, I examined this system and why it's proving extremely successful in many Vermont schools.
We just say what we hear around our classmates, what they like most about the day, and if there's like a teacher they can trust at the school. Some days people feel tired, some days people feel energetic.
Meet 4th grader Kaylin Wendell and 5th grader Sheba Nabukenya. The two students at Gertrude Chamberlain Elementary School in South Burlington are ensuring kids' voices are heard. The pair are proud leaders amongst their peers who know they're influencing change.
A lot of the kids are excited and you just think like, hey, I helped improve that.
Valuing student input is a strategy PBIS, Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, prioritizes. PBIS is a multi-tiered, school-wide model to address social, emotional, and behavioral needs of students. The 3 levels: universal, targeted, and intensive. Under Tier 1 universal supports, the school community identifies and defines the expectations for all. Gertrude Chamberlain's, we are kind, we are responsible, we are safe, words which hang as reminders throughout the building. Students are taught the expectations and how to follow them in each location, from the playground to the cafeteria to the bus.
If you're walking down the hallway, you're going to notice that just the hallway expectations are blown up and put up around the hallway with visuals.
When Holly Ruel took over as principal at Gertrude Chamberlain 11 years ago, the school didn't have a structured behavioral support system.
It was very reactive, and we had some really strong behaviors here. So it was typical to see a child in the hallway ripping the artwork off, some swearing.
Now PBIS is embedded into every weekly, daily, and hourly routine. Wolfpack time is one core tenet of the PBIS system here. Every Wednesday, students from each grade form a circle in their classroom to learn a social-emotional skill or discuss a challenging topic.
So we just really have normalized those practices as an entire school community.
And per the PBIS framework, data about behavioral problems drives real-time adjustments.
So you can see that in November we've had a spike, so our universal team was looking at that and trying to come up with some ideas about how to decrease behaviors for the month of December.
Megan Goyette helps lead that universal team of special educators, counselors, behavioral experts, and students, Sheba and Kaylin.
The students are more comfortable talking about things that happen to them at school or mistakes that they make and learning from it and growing instead of being fearful that they're in trouble.
Goyette collaborates closely with classroom teachers to incorporate social-emotional learning into their curriculum. She fosters trusted relationships with classroom teachers, offering concrete tactics to boost student engagement, provide positive praise, and correct inappropriate actions.
Building that mutual respect and then trying something out. So once a teacher tries something, they might be hesitant, but if they're willing to give it a try and then they see the results, I feel like that gets the ball rolling.
The basic idea is we're looking to do everything we can to change the environment that's going to set students up for success, rather than trying to change individual students' behavior.
Amy Wheeler-Sutton is a member of the Vermont PBIS state leadership team. Since the group was established in 2007, 168 schools of the state's about 300 have joined the tight-knit network. Wheeler-Sutton explains PBIS is shifting the paradigm from an antiquated, punitive approach to a modern, preventative one.
What brings us joy and what makes us happy?
Treating behavior much like we do with academics. So on the front end, really explicitly teaching and giving feedback to students, just like you would if you're teaching, multiplication. But then also on the other end, if a student didn't know how to multiply, you wouldn't suspend them or you wouldn't give them a detention. You would reteach and you would give them the skills and strategies to be able to solve that multiplication problem.
Vermont PBIS says about 80% of students should succeed with just Tier 1 universal supports. What's proving to you that this system is working at Gertrude Chamberlain?
Last year, if I brought this student down here to talk about something, he would be flipping out crying. This year I'm talking to him and he's telling his friend, it's okay, they're here to help us.
So the proof is in the progress.
Yeah.
The proof is also in the statewide data. Vermont PBIS cites in 2019, the average out-of-school suspension rate in PBIS schools was about 2%. The rate for non-PBIS schools was 3.5%. Gertrude Chamberlain has established a system so successful, Education Secretary Dan French recognized the school as a model for other districts. Ruel says she could not imagine navigating the pandemic without PBIS.
When I talk to my colleagues, it's a lot calmer here at Chamberlain than what other people are talking about.
Now, the Agency of Education tells me by law, all Vermont schools must implement some type of a multi-tiered system of support for academics and behavior, but they are not required to join the formal PBIS network. 2 years into the pandemic, though, PBIS data demonstrates what the state has been telling us. Students are struggling, whereas only about up to 15% of students typically need targeted supports and up to 5% require those intensive supports. Schools are now seeing those numbers tick up at least 5%, meaning the PBIS pyramid is top heavy. Tomorrow night here on Channel 3, I'll examine the targeted and intensive levels of support, why the growing need is straining school resources, and how strengthening universal supports could be the solution. Meet Henry McBroom. The 6th grader hasn't spent much time in school, so he's found solace at skate parks, always concentrating on the next trick. It's a place where his mother, Catherine Taylor McBroom, says they both get a break from the worries outside these walls.
He feels alienated, and of course this is where he doesn't feel alienated.
Here, Henry is a cool, funny, charismatic kid. At home, Catherine and her husband store the thick stack of Henry's disciplinary slips, school suspensions, and mental health surveys dating back to first grade.
He's had to have school evacuated and classrooms and gyms. We went to work every day, not knowing when we were going to get called and what was going to happen, so that stress was there almost every single day. It feels like your child is drowning and there's no way you can help them.
Over the years, Henry has caused several disruptions at Edmonds School in Burlington, from throwing lunch trays to jumping down stairwells to threatening to bring a weapon to class.
You get the email like, this happened at school, and that's your kid. I don't want to minimize other kids' experiences with things like that happening. There's another side to this that's, is not comfortable.
It's the aftermath of that internal threat. Once police cruisers have cleared the scene and kids are back in the classroom, the team of people who are answering that student's cry for help.
All kids want to be successful, and I think all kids would demonstrate positive behaviors if they felt like they had the skills to do so. When students act out, when they make threats, there's usually underlying causes or reasons for that.
Dylan McNamara leads those efforts as the social emotional learning director for the Essex Westford School District.
We pulled together a group of adults that have both mental health expertise as well as have familiarity with a student. We want to look at whether or not a student has access to weapons, whether they have some underlying mental health challenges, whether they have a history of using violence to solve problems, or whether they believe that violence is the way to solve problems. We want to look at what level of supervision and support do they have outside of school.
Collecting that information helps the district determine the credibility of the threat, but McNamara says more importantly, what level of support the district should be providing to the student. Immediately, the team designs a short-term safety plan, like parents locking up weapons at home and counselors conducting daily bag checks. Then, it's the school-based mental health clinicians who hold that student and family's hands for the long haul.
We're trying to really kind of open reflection with the student and understand the intent of the action. We really believe that all behavior is communication, so what was the behavior trying to communicate? Is this student feeling disconnected, marginalized in some way, angry, embarrassed?
The Howard Center has clinicians embedded in every Chittenden County school except one. Alice Scannell supervises several in the South Burlington and Mount Mansfield Unified School Districts. These case managers might collaborate with the 24/7 hotline First Call in a crisis to stabilize a dysregulated student, administer a mental health assessment, refer to an outpatient provider, or even recommend a residential facility. In the weeks and months that follow, clinicians serve as a liaison between administrators and the family, establishing strategies to meet treatment goals, reporting the student's progress, and strengthening ties with loved ones they may have strained.
When students are going through this, I think an invisible piece of it is the emotional toll that happens for the parents of students who do this behavior. They're just going through a level of shock, then sometimes denial, anger, grief, confusion, and it's really isolating for those parents.
Emotions wrought with shame and guilt, over which Catherine Taylor McBroom has shed many tears.
It breaks you down.
The McBrooms utilized all of those resources, and she's confident they are effective for most. But Henry's process was slow, in part due to the pandemic and Vermont's shortage of psychiatrists. Ultimately, she tells me she hopes sharing hers and her son's story will discourage the community from demonizing troubled children and judging the struggling parent.
We give him lots of love. We fight for him for everything, for his IEP, for his behavior interventionist, for his Howard Center resources.
After multiple misdiagnoses, Henry only recently learned he's living with bipolar disorder.
How do you think people view you?
They view me as a bad person. They view me as maybe an evil person.
What would you want people to know about you who may not know you very well?
I'd like them to know that I've changed and that I'm more calm now and I can be chill, and if you just give me a chance, I can be a good person and you can see it.
Now on a different medication.
He's doing so well.
Catherine is grateful for those who supported them in the Green Mountain State. Since I sat down with them, the McBrooms have moved closer to family in Tennessee.
How does it feel knowing you're going to get a fresh start?
Oh, it feels so awesome. I feel like I'm on top of the world. I feel amazing.
In Burlington,
Everybody will see a new me.
Christina Guessferd, Channel 3 News. For 3 decades, the state of Vermont has prioritized deinstitutionalizing care for vulnerable populations, regardless of the severity of their disability. But what can families do when harmful behaviors escalate and their child is too challenging to control and keep safe? Tonight, I'm taking you to Essex to meet a curious and charismatic boy who's inspiring his parents to fight for a better future. It's a story you'll only see right here on Channel 3.
Down by the bay.
Music, a reliable remedy to ease Henry's restless mind. These therapy sessions are a weekly high note. The 10-year-old marches to the beat of his own drum. Sweet and spunky. But if Henry gets in even the smallest of jams, he can quickly change his tune.
He has, many forms of developmental disabilities, including intellectual disability, autism, ADHD. Obviously, the seizures, they affect his, motor skills, his communication skills, all of his skills, and they do cause regression.
Henry's screams and cries often fill the halls of the Langevin household. But it's his frequent and dangerous meltdowns that are so difficult for his mom, Leslie, dad, Eric, and 8-year-old younger brother, Zach, to manage.
Really, it's just this straight-out exhaustion. Henry is staffed 2-on-1 because he's physically so big and he needs 100 pounds and he's kind of a bull. So, we can't say no, we can't say stop. We're always engaging and keeping him personally safe. And then sometimes he can be aggressive. So it's keeping Zach safe and protecting our property. You're hypervigilant every step of the day. Almost every single night, Henry gets up 3 to 5 times, whether it's you're helping him with seizures or he might be trying to hit his head on his wall, if he has a headache.
He can overpower me now, and that's scary.
He can push me down.
He's getting bigger and stronger and taller. So we're just trying the best.
Yeah.
Henry has suffered several life-threatening seizures and feels chronic pain. The family of 4 has relied on state resources and nearly full-time personal caregivers since Henry was 5 years old. The Langevins say the small doses of respite still aren't enough to cure the chaos they endure daily.
What does Henry mean to you? Well, I love him, and he's little.
It's tough.
Yeah. I talk to my therapist every week.
It wasn't until last fall that we kind of had reached this boiling point of oh my God, we need help.
The Langevins explored shared living providers for children with both developmental disabilities and medical complexities. They soon learned Vermont doesn't have one. The closest locations are hundreds of miles from their Essex home.
He's part of our family. He's our firstborn child. I think the thought of sending him away is gut-wrenching.
So when that seemed like the Langevins' only option, they decided to forge another path.
It really just came to me, and I was I'm going to build a therapeutic community residence in Vermont.
2-story, 3-bedroom home.
The now nonprofit is called Building Hope for Children. The proposal, a local modern farmhouse with sensory rooms, an accessible playground, a chef's kitchen and dining space, and a studio apartment for a 24/7 nurse. The program would provide on-site services including physical and occupational therapy, field trips and outdoor activities, plus psychiatric consultations and individual counseling. The cost comparative to similar out-of-state programs at between $225,000 to $250,000 per child. The most important principle, an open-door policy for families and friends. Through donations and grants, the Langevins are fundraising for $1.75 million. The goal, break ground next year.
Finally an opportunity to get to rest. I never get to.
The house is going to be beautiful. It's going to be like Disneyland. I wouldn't put my kid in anything less than that.
But for all its magical properties, the project could turn out to be just a fairy tale. On this journey, the Langevins will have to jump over significant legal hurdles to make that group home happen. A Vermont law established 3 decades ago in response to the state's shadowed past could put those plans in jeopardy. Tomorrow, I'll tell you why officials say as the proposal stands right now, it is not legally possible. Until the end of the 20th century, society segregated developmentally disabled people, hiding them behind brick walls. Vermont's policy, established in response to the state's shadowed past, is rooted in respect and dignity for people who've historically been dehumanized. And that policy could put the Langevins' plans in jeopardy.
The biggest taken away, I didn't belong there. That's the bottom line. I didn't belong there.
I wanted to be like normal, like everybody else.
Some former residents of the Brandon Training School remember their experience there fondly. Many reflect on the flaws. Founded as the Vermont State School for Feeble-Minded Children in 1915, the public institution once housed more than 600 people and served a total of more than 1,300 men, women, and children. The Brandon Training School's closure in 1993, proof of a paradigm shift in that philosophy. Then, in 1996, Vermont passed landmark legislation. 3 decades since the Development Disabilities, or DD Act, became state statute, officials firmly argue institutionalization is an archaic and detrimental approach.
What lessons learned from the Brandon Training School influenced this transition towards home care?
Persons with developmental disabilities or any disability are a valued and critical part to the heart of Vermont's communities.
Monica White is the Vermont Disabilities Aging and Independent Living Department Commissioner. Per the DD Act, Vermont only offers a variety of in-home family supports and community services for children.
The menu is large and it's tailored to the needs of each individual child and family. And by and large, that has been extraordinarily successful over the past 3 decades.
By codifying inclusion and integration, institutions for children are forbidden. The provision reads in part, children, regardless of the severity of their disability, need families and enduring relationships with adults in a nurturing home environment. The quality of life of children with developmental disabilities, their families, and communities is enhanced by caring for children within their own homes. White tells me she can't disclose exactly how many kids currently receive out-of-state residential care, but the number is less than 11.
Those out-of-state residential placements that do happen are typically very targeted, very short in duration for longer-term stabilization within the community back here in Vermont.
So does the Langevins' proposal deviate from that law?
A facility such as that does not sound like it would be in alignment with Vermont's current principles for developmental services.
But, White notes, the department hasn't yet received a formal proposal to officially make that determination.
That would have to be an exception to the normal rule.
An exception Ken Schatz asserts must be made. During his 6-year tenure as the Department for Children and Families Commissioner, Schatz facilitated some of those out-of-state placements. Often kids in abusive situations because their parents struggle to care for them. As a former state official, can you confidently say that this is a significant and serious gap in the state's system?
I believe it is.
Compelled by the Langevins' story, Schatz has joined the Building Hope for Children Board of Directors. He agrees the state should prioritize home and community-based services, but
there are a tiny number of children like Henry that really require more.
And Schatz says Building Hope for Children's concept illustrates the stark differences between the prison-like Brandon Training School and the Langevins' ambitious vision. If the state doesn't authorize the project, Essex representative and social worker Tanya Vihovsky vows to advocate at the Capitol during the upcoming legislative session to turn these renderings into a reality.
Every one of those child's lives and experiences matter, and even if it's 3 children that would be otherwise out of state, those 3 children deserve to be in their home state surrounded by the people that love them. A lot of times we get really sort of stuck in this is the policy, this is the way it is, without thinking about, well, why is it that way, and are there ways that we need to change it to better meet the needs of people? And there is not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Now, back at home in Essex, the Langevins are leading that charge to change the state's system.
I hope for families like us that I can provide a service and a model that Vermont could take on.
This past legislative session, Vermont passed Act 186. It's a law that creates a pilot program which will award grants to 3 entities planning to build congregate housing for individuals with developmental disabilities. Anyone can submit a proposal, including the Langevins. But Dale Commissioner Monica White tells me she believes the legislation is intended for adult care, not children. Still, the language in the law does not specify, so the parameters are up for interpretation. One factor is time. Many want to wait and see how other kids respond to the shot before they're comfortable giving it to their own. Experts tell me that's common with any new medicine, regardless of how much it's studied. But really, this distrust in vaccines specifically spans back to the birth of vaccinations, then escalated in the 21st century. Ultimately, I wanted to answer the question, when did parents go from eager to uneasy? Tonight, I put vaccine hesitancy into perspective, starting with one of the most feared viruses in recent history.
The word fear really rings true. People were very, very frightened.
When Leslie Williams contracted polio as a child in 1954, her family was forced to quarantine. The community, terrified their kids might catch the contagious virus that crippled or killed tens of thousands. Williams was in a coma for several days at the hospital, though she harbors memories of the horror.
I do remember seeing one of my parents with a mask and a gown because they had to be all dressed up before they could come in the room.
Luckily, Williams walked away from the deadly disease. In the early 1950s, polio outbreaks caused more than 15,000 cases of paralysis each year. Then, in 1955, a new vaccine promised panicked parents protection.
There was like a mad rush to get vaccinated. We couldn't wait to get vaccinated. Everybody couldn't wait to get vaccinated.
3 decades later, polio was eliminated from the United States, and there hasn't been a case in the country since.
And that's solely a result of successful vaccination.
Dr. Benjamin Lee is a pediatric infectious disease specialist at UVM Children's Hospital. He says the majority of his young patients receive all the usual immunizations, including measles, mumps, rubella, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, meningococcal, and polio, to name a few. All severe illnesses we rarely see in developed countries today.
Our experience with other routine childhood vaccinations resoundingly tell us that vaccines work. They're safe and they're effective.
Still, Lee says an increasing number of families aren't convinced by that evidence. About half of his patients' parents have questions and concerns about the COVID-19 vaccine, worried their child could get seriously sick from the shot. And that ratio is reflected throughout the United States.
What we know, certainly across not just the United States, but across the world as well, vaccine hesitancy is becoming an ever more urgent problem.
Lee projects people have grown accustomed to protection against deadly diseases, perhaps losing sight of the significant scientific progress that got us here. The onslaught of the COVID-19 pandemic isn't when confidence plummeted. At the turn of the century, a fraudulent research paper suggested a link between autism and the MMR vaccine. In the years since, postmodern society's perception of vaccinations has shifted in part due to government mandates, political polarization, geographic differences, and racial disparity.
People's questioning of science isn't all or none. People may have questions about one vaccine, but have gotten all the rest.
But public health and health policy expert Dr. Jan Carney says reluctance really took root in the age of the internet, which is probably why vaccine hesitancy rates are highest among our youngest populations.
Being informed patients, that's a really good thing, because if you're using good sources of information, you can be a better partner to improve your own health and the health of your family. And one of the keys is, where are you getting that information?
Carney says a knowledgeable patient turns to accredited healthcare websites rather than social media sources, which can be inaccurate and unreliable.
I think that it's important to look at today's events in a historical context, but not be afraid to try to change them, because we can.
People like Leslie Williams, who've lived through both periods of history, stand by a strong opinion.
To me, it's baffling why a parent would choose to not have their child vaccinated and put that child at risk, and then put all the other children in the classroom at risk.
It's important to distinguish vaccine-hesitant parents from those who don't vaccinate their kids at all. Experts say there will always be a core group of holdouts, whether for religious or social reasons. Medical professionals tell me their goal is to keep that group from growing. One critical strategy to combat vaccine hesitancy, helping people develop a solid personal relationship with their healthcare provider. Terminating a pregnancy is a major medical event. The experience is incredibly intimate. While every person's story is unique, it usually starts with someone making one of the most difficult decisions they've ever made, forever changing the trajectory of their life. And that's where we start tonight, with a Northeast Kingdom woman who 11 years ago had to do just that. Tucked into West Glover, lifelong Vermonter Kelsey Creelin calls these woods home. During a short stint working in Los Angeles in 2011, Creelin recognized the telltale signs she was pregnant. The then 26-year-old and her then boyfriend planned to move back to Vermont and raise the child here.
We were going to have a family.
But after 5.5 months, feeling the baby grow in her belly, the foundation Creelin laid to build that family shook.
That is when the doctor found that the child had Dandy Walker syndrome, which means the cerebellum wasn't developing, so the spinal cord and the brain weren't connecting. There's a lack of consciousness, they're not able to communicate, they're not able to have memories.
The debilitating genetic anomaly, a devastating discovery for the soon-to-be mother.
You still have that residual sense of failure almost.
Her doctor explained the child's lifespan would be short, caring for it would be a full-time job, and their life would be extremely challenging.
I would have taken it on if I felt like the child would have had a quality of life, honestly. I felt like it would have been cruel to bring that person into the world.
Creelin weighed her options and with help from her doctor decided on a second trimester abortion.
Which was an induced labor. So I gave birth to the baby, and they set you up with grief counseling, and they encourage you to hold your baby. At 6 months, they're developed. You know, they're just little people. It was so surreal.
Grappling with loss and guilt, Creelin tells me it took time and an abundance of support to accept her plight. An obstetrician gynecologist at UVM Medical Center, Dr. Lauren McAfee, has witnessed similar stories firsthand.
The way that our society has really seen and portrayed and understood abortion has made it really hard for us to humanize it.
Her passion, supporting patients often stigmatized within the medical community, namely women seeking abortion. Her priority, guiding patients through the process with respect and empathy, ensuring ultimately the decision is theirs and theirs alone.
I try to handle this as understanding where patients are coming from, what information they need to help them make their decision, and then help them walk that path together. We want to make sure that you get access to the medical care that you need and that you're seeking in a safe, non-judgmental, and compassionate way.
For more than a decade, McAfee has also carried her expertise into Planned Parenthoods. Vermont has 7 Planned Parenthood locations across the state in Barry, Brattleboro, Burlington, Rutland, St. Johnsbury, White River Junction, and Williston. After several closed during the pandemic, 5 of those clinics offer abortion services. So far this year, Vermont's Planned Parenthood providers have performed 440 abortions. 7 of the individuals who underwent the procedure traveled far from home to the Green Mountains. Texas, Tennessee, states that have established so-called trigger laws, banning abortions that would kick in if the Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade. Last year, 1,015 abortions were performed at Planned Parenthood clinics, 24 patients hailing from outside New England. In 2020, 1,149 total and 14 patients from out of area. In 2019, 1,089 total with 15 out-of-area patients. Statistics that have stayed steady in recent years. Now 37, having healed from the heartbreak, Kelsey Creelan spends her days working several jobs to pay for the dream house she's raising from the ground up. A proud dog mom of 2.
The luckiest dog mom.
Her life 11 years later, not better or worse than the one that could have been, just different. And upon reflection, not a single regret. What do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions or misunderstandings about abortion and termination of pregnancy, both from the medical perspective and the emotional perspective?
Well, abortion's never plan A. Nobody wants to get an abortion. It's so invasive, mentally and physically. And I think that that is one of the things that gets completely lost in the conversation.
Just last week, Governor Phil Scott appointed Jennifer Morrison as the first woman public safety commissioner. We're witnessing this wave of women in all 3 branches of state government and in our own communities.
It did strike me that I will be very different looking from the other prior commissioners, and I probably will bring a different perspective. Different experiences.
Jennifer Morrison brings Governor Scott's cabinet, which consists of secretaries of agencies and the commissioners of financial regulation, labor, public safety, and liquor and lottery, to 54% women. 56% of non-cabinet commissioners, also women, and Scott's senior staff, 71% women. This past legislative biennium, Vermont also had the most women at the State House ever. 41% of the State House and Senate, the 10th highest in the country. We also saw the most women in legislative leadership positions ever, including the first ever Senate President pro tempore. Since 1791, only 15 women have served in statewide office and legislative leadership, a third of whom currently hold the positions. Senate President pro tempore Becca Balint, Speaker of the House Jill Krawinski, Treasurer Beth Pierce, Lieutenant Governor Molly Gray, and Attorney General Suzanne Young. In the judicial branch, 40% of Vermont Supreme Court justices, 31% Superior Court judges, and 57% of assistant judges are female.
It's diversifying the representation at every level of government. It's taken a really long time.
Emerge Vermont Executive Director Elaine Haney says that's because women haven't historically had political role models. The organization recruits, trains, and encourages Democratic women in office. She says this trend began in the latter half of the 20th century, primarily since the 1980s, when Madeline Kunin was elected Vermont's first and only female governor. Haney attributes the uptick since to a societal shift.
Women were staying home, raising children, being homemakers, or working from the home in a way that was very traditional. And politics was not seen as a place for women to get involved.
Then in the 90s, that positive progress stalled. That is, until recent watershed moments like the Me Too movement.
As terrible as that was in many ways, it was really great because it made people think really concretely about what are the obstacles that women are facing.
As the executive director of the Vermont Commission on Women, Carrie Brown has been tracking these trends for years. She says within the last decade or so, women have been coming out of the woodwork for seats on library boards, planning commissions, and city councils. Right now, 33% of Vermont Select Board members are women. Brown says it's imperative to keep building a bench of women serving at the local level to advance them through a pipeline to higher office.
I'm hopeful that we will see these numbers change even more in the future, and that, we'll get to a point where we're not even having conversations like this anymore. But we've still got a ways to go before that happens.
Brown says advancing women to local, state, and national leadership translates to the advancement of policies that reflect the needs of Vermont's 50% female population. In the past couple years, the Vermont Commission on Women, Change the Story, the Vermont Women's Fund, and Vermont Works for Women have all partnered to develop a free downloadable toolkit for employers to examine gender and racial equity in their company and compensation structures. Well, some are saying it's concerning because if regulators don't compel private providers to invest in inpatient psych care, they worry the state's critical bed shortage will never get solved, fueling those long wait times that leave Vermonters stranded in emergency rooms for days. But many mental health stakeholders are celebrating this decision as well. Tonight, I examine why private providers, including UVM Health Network, rarely volunteer to tackle this challenge despite the desperate need.
There's no value, for example, if we figure out how to pay for a building, but then can't run it.
UVM Health Network President and CEO Sunny Eapen acknowledges financial feasibility often governs the organization's choice to prioritize one capacity or improvement project over another. The network submitted a proposal to the Green Mountain Care Board last month for a new $130 million outpatient surgery center on its Tilley Drive campus in South Burlington. But just last April, leaders scrapped the inpatient psychiatric facility with a $158 million price tag.
The cost of the building, quite frankly, is about the same. Maybe it's a little bit more. But the cost to run it, we couldn't figure out a way how we could turn that into a self-sustaining model.
And if it's not self-sustaining, Eapen says other patient services would suffer. The network estimates the outpatient surgery center will start paying for itself within 6 months. In comparison, Eapen says the shelved $158 million psychiatric unit would have operated at a $20 million annual deficit, digging a deeper and deeper financial hole impossible to climb out of. A catch-22 that underlines the disparity between insurance reimbursement rates for medical services and mental health services. For instance, UVM Health Network says in fiscal year 2021 at Central Vermont Medical Center, Medicaid covered 21% of inpatient psychiatric services, commercial payers about 58%, and Medicare about 38%. Reimbursement far from on par with medical services. The Vermont Association of Hospitals and Health Systems explains project decisions come down to meeting the bottom line, not padding pockets.
Profitability often gets confused with, we would like to be able to do the service just to be made whole. And if we could be made whole, that would be incentive to keep moving forward in some of these large building projects or thinking about building projects.
VA's president and CEO Michael Del Trecco assures progress is happening. He points to the private-public partnership that nearly doubled the Brattleboro Retreat's inpatient capacity from 45 patients to almost 100 in the last 6 months.
It would be difficult for me to say that this isn't hard work, because it is hard work and it's an ongoing effort, and it's something that we're focusing on every day.
Data compiled by VA's cites on any given day between 25 and 30 people in crisis in emergency rooms are awaiting a transfer to inpatient mental health care, the majority for more than 24 hours, and some for a week or longer. Those individuals are occupying between 15 and 20% of all the state's ER beds. The ripple effect? Many medical patients presenting in the ER don't get immediate care. According to the Vermont Mental Health Department, last week's daily average availability for adult inpatient beds was 7, and for adolescent, 4, not nearly enough to meet demand. Facilities have been forced to close 24 vacant inpatient beds because they can't staff them. Deputy Commissioner Allison Crump also attributes these struggles to reimbursement rates.
Those of us who have been in the mental health field for decades have been sort of shouting from the rooftops, hey, let's increase the value of mental health services for some time. The state, we're the Medicaid payer. And so one thing we can do and have done is engaged in working out alternative payment models for paying for Medicaid services. We need commercial insurers to come along with us.
Meanwhile, how to capitalize on the $18 million while wrestling with the flawed system is up for debate. Several Vermont Emergency Department directors are imploring the Green Mountain Care Board to ensure the $18 million is invested in inpatient resources for acute cases. In the group's written comment to regulators, they suggest interventions like renovating current inpatient beds, expanding bed capacity in current units, bolstering staffing so existing beds that are currently closed can be utilized, or adding a transitional care unit. Calling the backlog a, quote, full-on human rights crisis, the ED directors write, quote, the terrible irony is that it's the sickest patients, the most vulnerable, who often wait the longest, and in most cases, they simply cannot be served in an outpatient setting. Green Mountain Care Board Chair Owen Foster says greater flexibility for the funds is a victory for Vermonters, so the network can find a balance between inpatient and outpatient resources.
The disparity in reimbursement rates. Can the Green Mountain Care Board develop an imminent solution to break down that particular barrier?
I don't think there are immediate steps within our toolbox that could be deployed as of now to help start solving the problem.
Who could come up with that solution then?
I think the problem is so multifaceted that it's going to take a village. It's going to take the legislature. It's going to take money. It's going to take AHS. It's going to take the governor's office. It's going to take the Green Mountain Care Board, insurers, hospitals, all providers.
UVM Health Network, in consultation with the Vermont Mental Health Department, is now tasked with submitting a proposal for how to spend the $18 million to the Green Mountain Care Board by the end of May. In that proposal, the network is also ordered to include an analysis of how the funds will specifically reduce the frequency and length of ER stays for both adults and kids, plus an analysis of how the investment will increase capacity for mental health services.